Hello and welcome to Day 2 of Innovate for Climate. Today's plenary is being held in collaboration with the Carbon Pricing Leadership Coalition, and we're going to be focusing on the key role of carbon pricing as a driver of low carbon transformation. We're going to look at long-term strategies for decarbonisation and ask what implementation might look like. Also, how can carbon pricing support a socially just and equitable transition for countries at all stages of development? If you have just joined us today, I encourage you to complete your profile on the website to enhance network opportunities, and also please do sign up for a workshop session. Anything that you'd like to attend, there are still plenty to choose from, so just make sure you check out the agenda. And also do drop into the marketplace, where you will be able to connect with inspiring climate action innovations and discover their inspirational plans. We very much welcome you to join in the discussion, so please do join us via the community page, and we invite you to tag us on social media using the hashtag #InnovateForClimate. If you do have any questions during this event, just a reminder, you can contact the Help Desk support team using the live chat function. Now, to open our session today, I am delighted to welcome Helen Mountford, Vice President, Climate Change, World Resources Institute, and Maurizio Cardenas, Senior Research Scholar at the Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia University.
Thank you, Anita. The world is paying increasing attention to this climate emergency. Back in 2020, the CPLC decided to convene a group of experts from different sectors to discuss what net zero means, and most importantly, how can we achieve it. In particular, we want to discuss the tools, the instruments to make sure that we get there. There's a large number of countries that have already pledged to achieving net zero by mid-century. Market-based mechanisms play an important role. They're not the unique and only instrument, but they can play a very important role. And among them, carbon pricing. So this group of stakeholders is discussing the role of carbon prices to make sure that we achieve the net zero goals.
The Carbon Pricing Leadership Coalition Task Force on Net Zero was formed really to contribute to a common understanding of what net zero actually means and to explore the role of carbon pricing in supporting the transition to net zero. A central focus for the task force's work is really the nexus between the commitments and strategies national and subnational governments are making on net zero and those of the private sector, including investors and banks. How do these actually work together, complement, and strengthen each other? So the task force work is building on quite a bit of other initiatives and other work, including previous CPLC reports, notably the reports we have of the High-Level Commission on Carbon Prices in 2017 and one on carbon pricing and competitiveness from 2019. But it also does benefit from work ongoing in multiple other initiatives to advance understanding around net zero targets, including such initiatives as the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, bringing together the asset owners, the asset managers, the banks, all with net zero commitments, the Science Based Targets Initiative for businesses and corporates to announce their net zero targets, the Mission Possible platform, the World Economic Forum's Net Zero Challenge, and many, many others. So really being able to bring all of these together, look at how to achieve net zero, what this means for different actors, and how carbon pricing can help support them.
This task force is unique. The key word is diversity. So we have representation from all regions, all sectors. It includes members from advanced, emerging, developing economies, from the public and the private sectors, from civil society, from financial institutions, from research. So really, it reflects a wide and diverse group of people with interest and with expertise on these issues. What we hope to do is to come up with a shared vision on the tools that can be used to achieve the net zero targets and the way in which we can accelerate the avoidance, the reduction, the removal of greenhouse gases. So diversity, again, is the key word here.
Well, the science is very clear. Globally, we need to get to net zero greenhouse gas emissions by about mid-century. Global net zero will only be achieved when human-caused greenhouse gas emissions have been reduced to the absolute minimum levels possible, and the remaining, what we call residual emissions, are balanced by an equivalent quantity of human-caused removals that are permanently stored. After net zero has been achieved, we then must move into a state of negative emissions where our removals exceed the emissions. So that's the sort of scientific basis for what we're doing. The initial findings of the task force really show that the scale and urgency of emission reductions needed means that we can no longer take action just where emission reductions are low cost, but instead must reduce emissions across sectors and countries as quickly and efficiently as possible. The good news is that increasingly the clean solutions, whether it's renewable energy, battery storage, electric vehicles, these are increasingly cost competitive with the polluting alternatives, so are simply a better economic and financial choice. And as we are all working now to build back from the COVID-19 crisis to rejuvenate economies, we find that investing in some of these, investing in energy efficiency, clean energy, restoring degraded lands, etc., all of these can generate as much as double or more the number of jobs that we'd see from the same investments in fossil fuels. So these are better choices. Moving on this net zero pathway will actually offer opportunities, but we do need to accelerate what we're doing. While all countries, sectors, and companies need to participate in this race to zero, different countries will achieve net zero at different paces. Massive reductions in global emissions, far beyond the pace of action we're seeing today, are needed to get us there. And the pathway or trajectory to get to net zero is just as important, if not more so, than the actual end date and getting to that end date. The development of national long-term emission trajectories, including short and medium-term targets, for example, intermediate targets for 2030 for countries, their NDC targets, for companies, for investors for 2025, 2030, these are going to be essential, and they must be aligned with the net zero trajectories overall. We also need separate targets for emission reductions and removals in many cases, and importantly, we'll use these to help identify and prioritize the sectoral transformations and the interventions that are needed to get us to net zero. While fundamental transformations are needed in the global energy and food systems in order to achieve net zero targets, we also find these need to be accompanied by active policies to ensure a just transition for workers and communities, and to ensure that socially vulnerable groups are not further marginalized in the process to net zero. This is an important recommendation from the task force's work. And finally, maintaining natural carbon stocks and increasing removals we recognize are incredibly important to help balance out emissions in the transition to net zero and as we reach net zero. Governments and the private sector must take care to ensure that reliance on these removals complements ambitious emissions reductions at home rather than diverting attention and investment away from it, and that the investments in removals support local environmental and socioeconomic objectives. So those are just some of the emerging messages from the work of the task force that I can highlight here today. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Carbon pricing is a very powerful instrument because it helps reducing emissions, but it also generates incentives for innovation. And we need better technologies. Carbon pricing, fortunately, already exists in about 81 countries. But the level of carbon prices is not high enough. We need to do better. We need to increase the level of ambition so that carbon prices deliver all their potential. One way in which this can happen is by making governments and companies adopt internal carbon prices, or what we call shadow prices, so that they can guide their investment decisions using these references prices, so that any major corporation, when deciding about a project, will incorporate into its decision the carbon price. Also, carbon prices can emerge through different mechanisms, through a carbon tax or an emission trading system. But the important thing is that the revenues that are collected with carbon prices help governments also reduce energy poverty. reach out to the poor. In addition, I have to say that carbon pricing is not a silver bullet. It has to be used in combination with other tools, regulatory, standards, finance, so that we bring a package that really helps delivering the reduction of emissions and the achievement of net zero. But this is a key and crucial component of that package.
Thanks very much. So first, we really need to get everyone onto the same page, as different initiatives and different individuals are each looking at a specific piece of the net zero puzzle and not necessarily seeing the whole. So we want to bring everyone together and understand the whole page, all of the different elements, how they fit together. So this is the aim of this current report. Beyond this, we know we're going to have some critical knowledge gaps to tackle, including around things like the limits of removal capacity and what are the technological opportunities or costs for emission reductions or for removals. And we'll also need agreement around the safeguards for natural removals to ensure they contribute actually to enhanced ambition and reduce risks of non-permanence or leakage, and also promote equity and support local communities. So there's definitely some there. Overall, I think critical to success is going to be reaching consensus on what are comparable metrics and standards around net zero targets, for the trajectories that governments and the private sector can take to reach them, to ensure that these are credible, these are transparent, and so that the public can actually hold them to account for these commitments and we can compare across them. And finally, we will be needing strong governance and standardization of voluntary carbon markets and ensuring that these are compatible with any future compliance markets that may come on stream. So there's quite a lot of further work to do, but with this report, we're hoping to make an important start, which then can contribute to all those who are looking to set net zero targets, to monitor net zero targets, and to use carbon pricing to help achieve those.
Well, for our work to have maximum impact, we need the right time, and we couldn't think of a better opportunity than now in the post-pandemic recovery. We need the scientific evidence, and this report is going to reflect that. But we also need to reach out to the key stakeholders and the key players so that the right decisions are taken. We're going to begin, after we finish this first draft of our report, a series of consultations with key players throughout the world so that they can provide us with their input. We need to find common ground. We need to generate as much consensus as possible. This is a growing area where there's lots of views, and we even need to begin with agreeing on the definitions, but also with a roadmap on how to achieve net zero, so that more than just targets and goals, it's about instruments, it's about process, and as Helen said, is about a continuum of targets and successes. So that stakeholder consultations should result in an improved report that will be ready to be launched right before, well, in anticipation of the Glasgow COP26. That's what we plan to do in the next few months.
Thank you to Helen Mountford and Mauricio Cardenas for sharing with us the findings of the CPLC task force. Now, there is no question that limiting global temperature rises to less than 2 degrees requires urgent climate action, and that carbon pricing could well be one of the most effective tools policymakers can deploy. In recent years, there has been a growing interest in net zero. So, what exactly is net zero, and how does carbon pricing fit into the picture? We now bring to you some answers to these questions. We've asked leaders from around the world what they're doing and how they can ensure action is aligned, credible, and inclusive, so no one is left behind on the pathway to reach net zero. So I bring you now this insightful collection of contributions from leaders around the world.
Net zero means a different global economy, one where we balance climate change mitigation, adaptation, and social welfare for all people. It also means an opportunity for building a new energy system, creating jobs in renewable energy, green hydrogen, new technologies. having a sustainable food and land management system, and a new industrial circular economy. Net zero means opportunity. It also means a great challenge.
Fundamentally, to achieve a net zero economy, what we need is for every government, every company, every investor to set a goal for net zero by 2050 or earlier, to set, publish and have agreed a science-based target, to develop and publish a transition plan of how they will deliver those emissions reductions to meet those targets, and then to implement that plan and disclose annually on their progress. If we all get to work, we can achieve a net zero global economy.
What is most important is the pathway, which we must consider as important as the destination. Countries and companies must deliver today deep emission cuts, and only after that should they consider purchasing from others removal of carbon.
Net zero targets in Australia, like elsewhere, has transformed the debate from the vagaries of low carbon economic goals to put a real focus on the transition strategies that are required. Now, there are 4 T's in transition strategy. The first of that is timeliness. We've had a focus on 2050 as a net zero goal, but it's also reminded us about the importance of 2030 and the Paris mechanism, which is a ratchet mechanism which will then drive focus every 5 years thereafter. The second T is around transparency, and so not only governments having to communicate their transition strategy, but corporations as well. The third T is terminology. And really, in the last 12 months, we've seen incredible focus and accountability there for corporations on greenwash and the like around carbon neutrality and net zero pathways. And we've got to get that right. The fourth T, and critically, is technology. And Australia is a high carbon political economy, but is one where we've got significant opportunities. We have opportunities in clean energy, we have opportunities in green hydrogen, we also have very important opportunities in negative emissions drawdown technologies in carbon farming and in sequestration. But for that, we need proper carbon markets, proper carbon signals to guide the proper investments. You can say what you like about a policy ambition, but the policy mechanism is important with a government-backed system, and Carbon Market Institute has one of the world's first code of conduct for the carbon industry, which is providing integrity and insurance there.
We can start by getting the right carbon price. Joe Stiglitz and I, in a paper we published for the Carbon Pricing Leadership Coalition about 4 years ago, suggested a price of $50 to $100 a tonne by 2030. That was 4 years ago. The world's ambitions have increased to move closer to 1.5, and we've been slow in cutting emissions. So we should be aiming for the top of that range, $100 a tonne or more by 2030. So get the level right. And finally, we must develop the technologies that we hope people will use in response to those high carbon prices. So we must invest in around the world and share research, development, innovation.
When we put a price on something and value it, markets, companies, investors pay attention in a different way and will change their behavior to reduce those costs. Now more than 2,000 companies who are worth some $27 trillion of market capitalization are using internal carbon pricing to realize efficiencies, to drive down emissions reductions, and to change investment within their business. We also see that companies who are under a regulatory carbon price or expect to be so in the next 2 years are taking greater action on climate change. So the tool of carbon pricing from a regulatory perspective drives greater action.
For the European Union, the emissions trading system and therefore carbon pricing will remain at the heart of the way in which we get European Union emissions under control in a way that limits emissions with a high degree of certainty, but also provides the efficiency, cost effectiveness through the use of market mechanisms. We will be tightening the targets under the ETS to make sure that we're on a pathway towards reducing our emissions by at least 55% from 1990 levels by 2030. but also exploring ways in which we can expand the carbon markets to new sectors beyond the power sector, beyond the manufacturing sector, to explore ways in which the ETS, for example, could apply to the transport sector as well. One of the challenges, of course, of using carbon markets in a pathway towards carbon neutrality is that there will be fewer and fewer emissions reductions available to trade as emissions go to net zero. And we'll have to begin to develop markets that are based on removals of carbon dioxide emissions from the atmosphere.
To make carbon pricing ambitious and powerful, we must set a price that's high enough to incentivize a shift in economic behavior. But most importantly, to be inclusive and to be equitable, we must implement carbon pricing in a way that it does not add an added burden to those who can afford it least. One way to do that is to have a carbon dividend, which takes the revenue from carbon pricing and brings it back into the pockets of those who need it the most.
The Swedish climate policy framework establishes that Sweden shall reach net zero carbon emissions by 2045 at the latest, and after that, achieve negative emissions. Sweden has great experience of long-term energy and climate policies, starting already in 1991 with the introduction of one of the world's first carbon taxes. Since then, the Swedish GDP has increased by 85%, while greenhouse gas emissions have decreased by 27%. The carbon tax continues to be the cornerstone of economic instruments, and speaking from 30 years of experience, I believe I can safely say carbon pricing is effective, it's competitive, and it's good for society. Combined with the European Union emissions trading scheme, we have powerful tools for the green transition.
Canada is committed to achieving net zero by 2050. We have developed a comprehensive approach that targets all sectors of the economy to get there. Our plan is focused on reducing emissions while seizing the economic opportunity that the transition to a low-carbon future will bring. Key elements include a very detailed plan to achieve our 2030 target and to set the foundation for achieving net zero by 2050. Legislation that is required for the achievement of net zero by 2050, and a net zero advisory body of diverse experts. Our plan to take aggressive action relies in part on pricing carbon pollution. Carbon pricing, as a market-based mechanism, is indisputably the most cost-effective way to reduce emissions. Canada is firmly of the view that putting a price on carbon pollution is a critical tool for addressing the climate challenge. In this regard, we are very supportive of Chancellor Merkel's call at the Petersburg Dialogue for a global minimum price on pollution. As we have seen in Canada, a price on pollution is a critical tool to cut emissions and to drive innovation. That tool will work even better when more countries adopt it. Sharing our knowledge and experience in forums like the CPLC can help us all build on the momentum we have now helped create and can identify opportunities for further action and innovation.
This year, we launched Singapore Greenplan 2030, a roadmap that sets out concrete measures and targets towards sustainable development and net zero emissions. Given our unique circumstances as a small city-state, we are pushing the boundaries in climate action. For example, while we have limited renewable energy options, we plan to quadruple solar energy deployment by 2025. We need the right mix of policies and incentives to drive an effective and inclusive transition to a low-carbon future. Singapore was the first country in Southeast Asia to implement a carbon tax in 2019. The tax covers 80% of our total emissions, one of the widest in coverage internationally. At the same time, we work with companies to support energy efficiency initiatives and new low-carbon innovations. We are reviewing our carbon tax rate and trajectory to spur companies and consumers to switch to carbon-friendly products, services, and activities. International carbon markets can complement domestic carbon pricing policies to lower global emissions and stimulate private sector investment. As a trusted financial hub, Singapore can help the global push for sustainability through green finance, fintech, and capability building. Singapore is keen to share our carbon pricing experiences, especially with countries facing similar constraints. We look forward to greater international collaboration to galvanize concrete, effective, and inclusive action towards net zero emissions.
This year, the Norwegian government proposed to gradually raise the carbon price over the next decade. From today's price at around 60 euros per ton CO2, we will be aiming for a price of 200 euros per ton CO2 by 2030. This way, we will provide strong financial incentives for climate-friendly solutions and businesses. Our low-carbon development, sustainable policies, and new technologies are good for almost everyone, but they can also lead to changes in employment and in social transitions. Accounting for such structural elements is very important because we need to build broad support and we need to enable a green shift through that support.
Indonesia has already pledged the national determined commitment to reduce CO2. And for us to be able to deliver our commitment, we've already translated into our national medium-term development plan for 2020 to 2024. And we also established long-term strategy for low carbon and climate resilience 2050 that will chart the path to reach the net zero emission. Certainly, this kind of plan cannot be implemented without resources. And that's why the support from not our own budget, but also from other resources, including private sector and international community, is going to be very critical. For us, we also not only talking about the climate change and the funding, but also institutional setting. Indonesia has already set one agency which is organizing all sorts of funding, including initiative to establish carbon price within our national policy. This is important because for us to achieve the climate change, we definitely need to address carbon price. And carbon price can only work if there is a global mechanism to create a carbon market.
To harness the power of nature, we invest in our forests, wetlands, and land, implementing a border-to-border landscape restoration program. We are also addressing energy and transport emissions by phasing out biomass fuel for cooking and introducing aggressive e-mobility incentives. We have also faced difficulties in financing our ambitious plan to become a carbon neutral and climate resilient economy by the middle of the century. That's why we established the Rwanda Green Fund to act as the engine of green growth and facilitate investment in climate resilience. Initiatives taken by Rwanda will be enhanced by a strong carbon market. Rwanda is working to develop a carbon trading hub for mitigation projects at the national and regional level. The hub will unlock climate finance and investment for green projects in Rwanda and across the continent.
Achieving net zero emissions not only contributes to the objectives of the Paris Agreement, but also fulfilling our national priorities. And these national priorities are part of our development strategy as stated in our Vision 2030, where we have said that we are placing the environment at the center of all national development. Placing a price on carbon as well as participation in the carbon market can provide opportunities for Trinidad and Tobago to accelerate the net zero transition.
Sustainability has been embedded within the Atos company for a long time. And actually, Atos has set a science-based target and committed to reducing absolute scope 1, 2, and 3 GHG emissions by 50% from a 2019 base year. Thanks to the progress we have already made, we have actually advanced the date to achieve this target from 2030 to 2025 and have a target to be net zero by 2028. Atos has integrated sustainability throughout the company, in greening our data centers, offices, supply chain, and products. And now we're looking to harness the technology and business acumen to support other companies and our partners to decarbonize. While IT represents an estimated 4% of global emissions, digital transformation can enable an estimated 12 to 15% of emission reductions globally. We believe that carbon pricing can be a key tool in prioritizing and accelerating the transition to a low-carbon economy. Whether it is using carbon price internally as an internal cap and trade system or as a shadow price in assessing new investments, carbon pricing really levels the playing field and is able to really accelerate our goals of being a more sustainable, inclusive, global economy and achieving the low carbon ambitions.
Later this year at our Capital Markets Day, Sasol will be communicating our 2050 ambition and roadmap. Our aspiration for future Sasol is to position the company so that it's focused, streamlined and successful through our people and innovation. We want to transition Sasol as fast as we responsibly can, and the journey towards the net zero outcome has commenced, taking into account our just transition responsibilities in the country and the economic realities of the different pathways. Recently, we announced joint procurement of 900 megawatt of renewable energy by our Secunda operations in partnership with Air Liquide. This deal is the largest private sector procurement of renewable energy in South Africa.
EDP commits the biggest share of its investment in the green economy. We currently have around 65% of our EBITDA being sourced from renewable energy and a total installed capacity of 24 gigawatts, with considerable international exposure. Alongside that, we have 19 billion euros of investment in renewables by 2025, and we have ambitious plans to reach 50 gigawatts of renewable additions by 2030, which will move our production from 74% renewables as of today to 100% by 2030. At the heart of our business, we're also adapting our supply activity to a more conscientious, more demanding, and more digital customer, and we will provide continuous access to energy efficiency products and services, be it through the promotion of greater uptake of electrical vehicles, or helping companies capture opportunities powered by digitalization or other technological advancements in innovative business models. These sorts of strategies and ambitions go beyond just aligning with climate science. They're really important drivers of innovation, policy, partnerships, jobs, and most of all, provide the confidence to our stakeholders that our outlook aligns with theirs.
The official credit institute, as the Spanish National Promotional Bank, is playing a leading role to finance the transition to zero emissions. ICO is fostering sustainable investment through joint efforts on partnership with the private sector. We do it in a global perspective, cooperating with other European Union peers such as the European Investment Bank or the KfW in Germany, in initiatives such as the Joint Initiative for Circular Economy or the Clean Ocean Initiative. In the international market, we are focused above all in Latin America, working together with local but also with regional and multilateral banks. Together, we are deploying massive resources on sustainable projects under, for example, the Equator Principle.
Net zero has become an important rally point for investors as well as companies and countries. But a long-term commitment is not really valuable without change in the near term. It's vital that there is a near-term accountability for net zero targets to prevent time washing. This idea is central to the work of the UN-convened Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance, a group of 35 leading pension funds and insurers across the globe with $6 trillion of assets. They have committed publicly to supporting the net zero transition and publishing near-term targets for 2025 in line with this goal. Yet, Targets alone, whether by asset owners, companies, or even countries, will not prevent dangerous climate change. We need net zero economies, not just net zero portfolios. This will require incentives to drive capital towards the solutions. Of course, we cannot rely on any one policy tool exclusively, but the central importance of carbon pricing is beyond any doubt.
Achieving a state of net zero on a global level where produced and removed emissions are balanced will most certainly require collective action. National pathways will most likely require the design of carefully crafted and industrial and energy environmental policies. However, it's important to consider the evolving energy landscape that will have varying implications on different economies, particularly fossil fuel intensive economies. It's therefore critical that a global net zero pathway is inclusive, with non-prescriptive approaches that allow more nations to play a prominent role in decarbonization efforts and devise solutions that are compatible with their economic and social makeup. The announcement of the Net Zero Producers Forum by major oil producers representing 40% of global oil demand last month is a major feat in leadership, one that focuses on commonalities and enhances cooperation. The Circular Carbon Economy framework proposed during the Saudi G20 presidency is another approach that is inclusive and responsive to the social and economic realities facing nations wanting to play a role in fighting climate change.
For South Africa, it is critically important that we reduce emissions while addressing our key strategic priorities for job creation, poverty alleviation, and inclusive economic growth. It is within this context that Sasol is also transitioning our major coal to liquids operations. Against this backdrop, Sasol firmly believes that setting an appropriate price on carbon is a critical part of the suite of policy interventions required to achieve the transition to a lower carbon future and the Paris Agreement goal, a stable and predictable carbon price that recognizes the need for flexibility through incentives and subsidies is required to deliver on any climate goals. In this regard, a coordinated national vision is a prerequisite that gives clarity to all stakeholders and allows for spheres of government to work in harmony towards this vision.
Carbon pricing can play a key role in our transition to a net zero economy, but it needs to be combined with the right policies that incentivize investment and behavioral change amongst businesses and consumers. And these policymakers need to be providing stable investment and regulatory frameworks so they can increase the predictability of the necessary clean energy investments, avoiding overcharging electricity with unrelated costs, ensuring a level playing field for energy producers and consumers across regions, adopting a leaving no one behind mentality, promoting job retraining, and minimizing the negative impacts of changes in local industries while also reducing the energy poverty.
It's quite important that every nation and every jurisdiction knows that carbon pricing is an efficient way to reduce emissions, but it needs to be designed well and correctly. And what we've done in British Columbia, and this will be critically important as we move to net zero, is ensure that we give support to low and moderate income people. And we do that with our climate action tax credit to enable them to make the changes they need in their transportation and home energy to reduce emissions. And it's also really important to drive technological development and assist industry in making the transition.
In California, we are deploying a suite of incentives, regulation, and other programs, including the Cap and Trade program. The Cap and Trade program in California enabled us to achieve our 2020 greenhouse gas emissions reduction targets 4 years early. And now we are focused on achieving our 2030 goal, which is 40% below GHG emissions as of 1990. And we are doing that by deploying a suite of activities, including reducing emissions from the transportation sector, which in California represents 40% of our greenhouse gas emissions. This, coupled with our Cap and Trade program, sends market signals that encourage industry to invest in greenhouse gas reductions, and show them where they need to be placing their capital and innovation know-how to achieve our climate goals. In California, we have many communities that were left behind because of poor land use decisions and historic racism. Revenue from our cap and trade program allows us to fund strategies, incentives, and programs that directly benefit those communities that are the most impacted by both air pollution and by the impacts of climate change.
Any carbon pricing system has socioeconomic implications and needs to be carefully designed. Policies must consider people and the planet to ensure an inclusive and equitable transition to net zero.
In our case, this is particularly relevant as we are currently developing a just transition of the workforce policy to guide potential challenges that may arise in this transition to net zero emissions. We're of the firm view that any carbon pricing scheme must be designed in such a way to be able to deploy appropriately to maximize the benefits and impacts, including the engagement of stakeholders and the alignment with the just transition policies.
While carbon tax and markets for carbon offsets are important and obviously might lead to a win-win scenario, despite the controversies surrounding them, of concern, and really we are concerned as Africa, is that carbon markets are still shrouded in mysteries. So the need for fair and just regimes cannot be more urgent and necessary for Africa than the need for a commitment to net zero carbon emissions.
We are facing a climate crisis and we need to act. Net zero commitments are crucial, but to achieve them, we need climate action.
We can't keep emitting the amount of business as usual or even slowly reduce our emissions and think we can easily suck carbon out of the atmosphere. We don't have enough land or the technological capability to plant enough trees or to produce enough machines to directly remove carbon from the atmosphere in order to balance or cancel out the amount of emissions we are producing today. At WWF, we say that this must be the decade of action for reducing our emissions and the decade of readiness for investing in technologies to store and remove carbon.
But we will get there because the solutions we need, they get cheaper and more accessible every day. There isn't a one-size-fits-all solutions. Strategies can differ, tools can differ from country to country around the world. But it still remains my firm belief that at the center of all these tools, we need to have a price on carbon.
So as we know, this year's COP26 will be an important moment to provide businesses with rule books it needs and prioritizes. The challenges that lie ahead of us is the single most important one ever. This sort of feat will require considerable investment and government intervention on the policy and regulatory side, but it also needs the innovation, the skills, and the vision of the private sector and the support of society as a whole.
The transitions will have to be fast and they have to be just. We have to make sure that no part of the European Union is left behind as part of this transition.
This must be inclusive and actually within the principles of climate justice. It must be just, fair to incentivize African governments and African communities who are subscribing to net zero emission targets.
a really insightful look into carbon pricing and how it can help deliver on the goal of net zero. Thank you to all of our contributors. Now, a session I've really been looking forward to. We bring together Mari Pangestu, the World Bank's Managing Director of Development Policy and Partnerships. Fatih Birol is with us, Executive Director of the IEA, and Andrea Metzer, Costa Rica's Minister of Energy and the Environment. Welcome to all of you. Now, there has been, quite rightly, a lot of attention on net zero targets, and more countries and businesses are taking actions to set these up. However, there are also great concerns out there about what these targets will actually mean in practice. So why don't we just explore that now and find out what it's going to take to build confidence around net zero and that roadmap which will get us there. Mari Pangestu, may I start with you? Global decarbonisation, net zero, they are clearly critical. But how do you get inclusive engagement without leaving anyone behind?
Thank you for that question, Anita. We really need to have an inclusive engagement, especially including developing countries, because after all, 60% of CO2 emission is accounted for by developing countries. So how can forums like CPLC hear the voices of developing countries, make sure they're supported, and help to make sure that they can engage in the low decarbonization strategies that they must have. So you can see that out of that 60% of developing countries, 4% are the fragile states, poorest countries, and small island states, who are actually contributing only 4% of the emission, but the most impacted and the most likely to be left behind. And then you have the major emitters within the group of middle-income countries, accounting for close to 60%. One-third of that is China and India, where it's about just an affordable and inclusive transition to a low-carbon development strategy. So I think the issue is, how do we make sure that climate is integrated into development, to make sure that it's a just transition and it's inclusive. And this is the challenge for developing countries. Otherwise, you cannot have the engagement, their engagement in global decarbonization. And that requires them to do policy reforms, institutional strengthening, and most importantly, get the support in terms of financing and technology to enable them to respond to these challenges. And it's going to be very much country specific. So you do need to work at the country level. In poorest countries, it's about adaptation and resilience. In the larger countries, it is about transition to lower decarbonization strategies. And this will require a collective effort by all to support developing countries to be engaged inclusively in global decarbonization, as well as within the developing countries, to make sure that it is a just and affordable transition within these countries.
Okay, I mean there's geography, but there's also timing. Fatih Birol, if I can turn to you. The COVID-19 pandemic has caused major disruption to the energy sector, the very sector that needs the greatest transformation in order to achieve net zero. So with the IEA warning of a huge surge in global energy-related CO2 emissions this year because of increased coal demand, are net zero targets, in fact, enough to drive a clean energy transition? And if not, then what?
Thanks. First of all, you are completely right. What we say this year, 2021, we expected the global emissions will increase sharply. And this increase will be the second largest increase in the history ever. So there is a gap, widening gap between government targets, commitments, and so on, and what is happening in the real life. And this gap is widening. So therefore, the statements, commitments, and the political positioning of the country is something. What is happening in the real life is something else, in fact, something opposite. Now, this means it is not enough. What we need to do? 3 things very shortly. 1, governments need to declare, announce the policies, energy policies to reach those targets. Country X, let's say Japan, in order to reach my target in 2050, I will need this gigawatt of offshore wind, And this offshore wind will be financed from the sources X, Y, and Z. So it is under wind, efficiency, I don't know, solar, electric cars, and everything. This is number one, credible energy policies. Number two, these developments in the countries, what is happening each year, should be monitored and tracked. Are they on track, off the track, the governments? And third, and finally, this clean energy transition need to be made in a way that energy is still secure and affordable for the citizens. So these three areas, in fact, are the areas that the International Energy Agency, we are taking as top priorities for the IEA to help the governments around the world to reach their commitments.
Well, I mean, you raise a very important point. You know, it has to be related to real life. Let's zoom in on a real life example. In 2019, Costa Rica set up a net zero by 2050 goal while also developing a transition strategy that would create stable green jobs. Now, I think it's pretty fair to say the country is now seen as a bit of a role model. So, Andrea, what has been the main factor in getting traction for your efforts in Costa Rica, and what lessons have been learned along the way?
Thank you, Mary. I will say that first is to consider decarbonization as a development model issue. I totally agree that the main element here is to understand that this is not anymore an environmental aspect. This is what is the kind of development that we want to address and which are the opportunities. Yes, we develop our long-term strategy. We have a clear goal in 2050. But this doesn't mean that we will be implementing or postponing the actions that we need to implement. And this is, I think, where the magic is. We develop the long-term strategy, but we define short and medium-term policy actions, packages of policies. And we're also identifying which are the priorities for the investments to do this transformational change. And in terms of practical elements, I will say that probably one key issue is mainstreaming these decarbonization, these long-term strategies, these NDCs measures into our planning system. If you take our National Development Plan, you will see a specific measures there, and this how allow us to align our public, mobilizing our public resources to implement these measures that are stayed there. Of course, we required a big mobilization of other funds, but in terms of what are the national organization for this, it's to mainstream these into our planning systems. This requires whole of a government approach. And once we have there our clear measures and goals in our national plans, then we can be aligning the sectorial plans, transport, energy, agriculture, it's also integrating the whole economy. But to get there, and just a quick element, we need to develop a robust capacity modeling in doing good policy making. And this is where for developing countries, it is too important also to understand that we need capacity building and that we need support, technical assistance to address this modeling, this good policy making. And this is where CPLC, PMR, a lot of the programs from the World Bank can contribute to us in developing this kind of modelings.
Right, I mean, we're going to come to some of those in a moment, but just staying with this, I mean, there's policy, but there's also politics. Now, how do you convince people who have an electorate, and maybe a jittery electorate, maybe quite near-term goals and aims, that they have to, across the political divide, commit to this to make this realistic?
This is for me?
Andrea, this is for you.
Yes, okay. A very important question. And one is to demonstrate that this is to generate welfare and that this has an economic benefit, an impact, that this can generate jobs. And we are facing the post-pandemic. We're facing the pandemic basically right now, and a lot of very complicated economic situations with a very small fiscal space. So this is the other element to demonstrate that this is good for the economy, not only good for the environment, and that this will have an impact in the quality of life. At the end, that's what we're talking about, how to reduce air quality contamination, how to increase what we are seeing in jobs. And we have been developing also a lot of robust data, so we can go to the different ministries and to the citizens, telling about that this is the kind of development that we want, and this will improve the quality of life.
Okay, now, Fatih Birol, we circle back to policy now, because we hear about how putting a price on carbon can be very useful as a policy tool. But how effective do you think is carbon pricing in driving greater investment towards renewable energy?
I think this is one of the most critical factors if we are serious to mobilize money in clean energy. So if we leave everything as it is, if the governments do not take any measures, such as the introducing carbon pricing, clean energy will, or as you mentioned, the renewable energy will increase, but the pace of increase is so slow that we have no chance whatsoever to reach our climate goals. What we need is a bold and speed transition. So therefore, we need a suite of policies, and one of them is carbon pricing, at least for two reasons we need carbon pricing. One, in the short term, to punish the bad, and second, to incentivize the good. And the carbon pricing will play this role. It will tax the bad, which is the bad is of course in quotation marks the coal here, and provide incentive for clean energy, energy efficiency, and the others. But the second, in my view, more important, current clean energy options what we have, which is available, solar, wind, electric cars, they are far from being enough to reach our climate goals. We need innovation, new technologies. Investing in new technologies, it can be hydrogen, it can be new battery storage, and the others. In order to give the unmistakable signals to investors to invest in these technologies, carbon pricing is a must, a very important part of the equation. That alone is not enough, but a very important part of the equation.
Well, I mean, you've put innovation on the table. Innovation comes with a price tag. Mary Pengestu, how is the World Bank helping to advance the use of carbon pricing around the world?
Well, I think carbon pricing, as was just mentioned, is about getting prices right. And this is what in the policy reform and toolbox that we are working with countries as they design their low carbon development strategies. And I think we have been working with countries all along. And there's one misconception that someone told me recently, someone from the bank. They said, people get mixed up between carbon pricing and carbon taxes. In fact, carbon pricing includes what we have been working on for many years, including when I was in government, which is about taxes and subsidies reform on fuel and commodity. Right? That is actually already part of getting prices right. And that is an implicit carbon tax, which is a carbon pricing instrument. And then you have the standards, tradable performance standards, as well as shadow carbon pricing, which we have all been working with countries on this. More recently, I think the more explicit carbon pricing instruments, such as carbon taxes, which are more direct and linked to carbon content, and also emissions trading systems. So we are working and supporting countries to design the best policy for them. It tends to be very country specific. We have to listen to the country's needs and priorities. What is their priority? Is it revenue? Then it's probably more to do with taxes and subsidy reforms, as well as emission trading system. Is it simple governance? Then actually carbon taxes are better, but politically very difficult. compared to emission trading system. So we have to work with countries to really design it for their priorities and their needs. And even though it sounds simple, fuel subsidy reforms is actually politically one of the more difficult ones. I have my own experience with that. And it is really about how do you design it so that, as the minister from Costa Rica said, that you really have to show the benefits, right? How do you repurpose the subsidy that is on fuel, which is actually not benefiting the poor and the ones that need to be helped, and then repurpose that subsidy for the use of the poor and what we need to do to have a more inclusive development and create jobs and so on. So this is, I think, really how we must help countries design the right policies and get the prices right.
Well, I mean, let's get even. I mean, you sort of issued the challenge, get country specific. Let's get more country specific now. Back in the 1980s, Andrea Metz said Costa Rica had the highest deforestation rates in the world. But after Costa Rica introduced a carbon tax in 1997, there was a decrease in deforestation, right? And an increase in revenue for forest restoration, benefiting those on low incomes. So Costa Rica's experience certainly superficially seems to prove that carbon pricing can turn things around very quickly. But what are the limitations, would you say?
Thank you. Well, first is to understand that it's not only about carbon pricing. I mean, carbon pricing is one of the policy options, as we are hearing, but this needs also to address the whole policy framework. In this case, what we did at that time was to also put in place a law to forbid the land use change. So it was a clear law. Then we, with the money that came from, and that comes, because this is actually what is happening right now, that comes from this fossil fuel tax, we direct this to do the payment of environmental services. So at the end, we're also paying to the landowners of the forest. So it's a little bit all these policies aligning, understanding that yes, now it's more expensive to use these fuels, and we have a lot of opposition because, as you know, and I think my previous speaker was just mentioning, when we are addressing and talking about carbon pricing, it's not something that the citizens like to hear. It's a very difficult policy to be implemented. But in this case, what we managed was to demonstrate that this money was going to benefit, and it's benefiting a lot of rural population, indigenous communities that protect the forest. So I think that this is a little bit where the magic is. If we manage really to see that if we put a tax or if we eliminate a subsidy and we manage to transfer this to the vulnerable communities, then it's easier. Not it's simple, but it's we can manage then to implement this kind of policies.
Yeah, I mean, so since we're talking about difficulties, Maria Pengesto, you said, you know, in your own country you had experienced sort of similar hurdles. Talk us through that and how you get over those hurdles.
Yeah, I think actually Andrea has said it well. You know, these policies like fuel subsidy removal leads to a high price increase, inflation, and you know, how do you repurpose that subsidy to help the poorer households and actually you know, create? Actually, we actually used it also to build infrastructure, which is, you know, improving growth. So I think the challenge I see was already very well illustrated in the Costa Rica example. How do you create the narrative for governments who are run by politicians, to show that following a low decarbonization strategy is a win-win solution for growth as well as for jobs and for better quality of life? And to get to that narrative, I think what I have actually been working on this for a long time. How do we develop the tools and the data and using the science to model? I think Andrea used the word, how do we model in a country? How, you know, because basically politicians have a 5-year cycle or shorter or a slightly longer. So they want to see immediate impact. whereas a lot of the impact is longer term, right? So how do we demonstrate that there are short-term, medium-term, and longer-term benefits, both to that you can have low carbon growth, as well as that will achieve growth, climate, and equality and inclusiveness.
Right.
So this is really the challenge, and how that gets integrated into planning. And the narrative is important for the politician to convince the constituency and the stakeholders. So I think that's really the challenge, and we are working with countries to help them with their long-term development strategies and NDCs. Otherwise,
but I mean, I think
zero carbon doesn't become credible.
I mean, you've all accepted there are different countries, different pressures, different attitudes within countries. Fatih Birol, I mean, you've said before that more than 2/3 of global emissions come from emerging economies, and almost all the growth is going to come from these emerging countries in the next 30 years. So how can these countries shift investment away from fossil fuels into clean energy at the pace and the scale that you've talked about?
It is, in my view, this is the nerve center of entire climate debate. There is enough capital in the world, there is enough money in the world, but money goes in the clean energy investments basically in Europe and North America. But as you rightly mentioned, the emissions growth is coming from Asia, Latin America, and elsewhere. So what needs to be done? Very roughly two things. One, in the emerging countries, governments need to design an investment framework to get the investments domestically and internationally in order to build the economies of the future for their own countries and for their own good. It's number one. Number two, we have to look, all the countries around the world, whether or not we have to make amendments in the international financial architecture to give additional support to developing countries for their mobilizing clean energy investments. And in that respect, World Bank, World Economic Forum, and IEA working on a study coming out very soon, how to finance clean energy investment in emerging countries.
Well, Andrea Metzer, getting to net zero is going to require, as we're hearing, a lot of finance to enable emissions reductions and resilience. You've said this yourself, to build at scale. Let's just talk about Latin America. What can developing nations across the whole of Latin America do to get into the front of the queue, the front of the line, if you like, to attract climate finance?
Thank you. What we need is to generate a good enabling environment. This is about giving certainty to the investors. It's about aligning public and private resources and cooperation. We really need to have these long-term policies. This gives clear signals, but we also need to work to de-risk the kind of investments. And this is where the MDBs can play a critical role, not also in supporting developing countries in technical assistance for developing good policies, but also in generating a good financial architecture so we can de-risk and try to attract more private resources. So I think it's about this, aligning public, private, and cooperation money to catalyze the change we need.
Well, a little earlier, I caught up with high-level champion for COP26, Nigel Topping, who had this to say about the collective action needed to accelerate the race to zero.
Firstly, governments can create clear conditions and incentives for private sector investment in low-carbon technologies, aligned around the sectoral transition pathways which are becoming increasingly clear for every sector. So, clear phase-out dates for old technology that's no longer competitive, coal burning, combustion engines. And of course, carbon pricing can play a key role in these transitions, as we've seen in the UK with the floor price for carbon helping accelerate the move away from coal burning. Then, of course, investment in infrastructure and maybe fiscal support. I mean, early days of the technology, like for cars in the next few years, until EVs are cheaper than combustion engines to produce. And then, of course, helping new low-carbon industries get off the ground with specific support. I think of things like green hydrogen, sustainable aviation fuel, etc. And it's really clear that the carbon markets are going to play a big role here, and landing agreement at COP26 will be necessary to ensure, firstly, faith in the multilateral system, like to make sure that the family of countries can deliver the rules, because both governments and businesses need clear rules of the game, and that will allow us to really build traction on top of the massive growing number of net zero commitments, where it's clear that offsets aren't an alternative to companies reducing their emissions, but that there'll be something where there's a real appetite to invest, to go further and faster, in particular to help those companies and communities in vulnerable countries in sort of forest and coastal communities where the transfer of payments for those ecosystem services can be so significant a development boost. And really for me and my role as high-level champion, at the heart of this is the Race to Zero, which is this global campaign to get as many businesses, investors, cities and regions to commit to net zero in a robust way. Over 4,000 already in the race, over 10 trillion of turnover, over 70 trillion of assets from investors and banks. And I think here it'd be great to work with CPLC to inspire action and accelerate that transition by getting all the CPLC members who are non-state actors, all the regions, all the cities, all the businesses, investors to join the race. And as I say, that means not just setting a clear net zero goal before 2050, but also then publishing short-term plans and then transparency on progress. That's the challenge by COP26, and it's what will determine the winners and losers in the race to zero carbon future.
Thank you very much to Nigel, and of course to Mary, Fatty and to Andrea for your time and invaluable insights into such a detailed agenda. Well, we are now drawing to the end of today's plenary, but I'm delighted to announce we have two esteemed closing speakers. First, Faker Sibesma, Honorary Chairman of the Royal DSM and CPLC Champion. Thank you very much, Faker Sibesma. Welcome. It's over to you.
Thanks, Anita. Thanks to all of you for joining. Innovate for Climate, organized by the World Bank and CPLC. I think very important we address the issue of climate change today. Today, everybody is dealing and struggling, of course, with the corona crisis and the impact of it for all of us globally. The next pandemic will maybe be a lesser surprise because we see it coming, climate change. And therefore we need to address that with much more power and much more speed right now. Already many countries see the adverse effects of climate change. Countries who cannot be accused causing it, like Ethiopia or Bangladesh in their food production. And therefore we need to work on parallel, next to mitigation, also on adaptation, because for some countries it's already reality today. Adaptation is needed, the race to resilience, to make countries resilient in their food production, in cities, in infrastructure. But obviously, we need to continue also with mitigation, addressing our emissions and getting that back to a net zero by 2050, the race to net zero, reducing our emissions. And it's not only the endpoint of 2050, but also the intermediate steps in the roadmap towards that endpoint. Next to that, we need to be transparent on our emissions, but also on the financial consequences. Also for investors who know how we're doing as companies and how we are progressing and how climate is impacting us. And last but not least, we need also to embrace different carbon policies. Carbon policies by governments, and companies can support governments to put those into action, to create a low carbon economy. And carbon pricing has shown to be one of the most effective tools to come to a low carbon economy. So I hope that more companies embrace carbon pricing and also preparing for that via an internal price on carbon. 1,600 companies around the world already do that. DSM just increased its internal carbon price from 50 to 100 euros per ton. It's an effective tool. Some people are afraid that it will impact competitiveness or jobs or economic growth. But the high-level commission, which I shared together with Anand Mahindra, on competitiveness of carbon pricing has shown that when implemented right, it's not needed that it affects carbon pricing on the economic growth. So therefore, I think it is a tool that we need to embrace. Hopefully globally, hopefully with more industries, and hopefully with a meaningful price. If we do that, jointly, we can address climate change via adaptation, via mitigation, to the benefit of people today and generations to come. It's needed that we act together now.
Well, thank you very much, Feiko, for that perspective, drawing on many years of leadership on carbon pricing. So let me now welcome Stephanie von Friedeberg, Senior Vice President of I4C, who will share her views on carbon pricing with a unique private sector perspective.
There is no question that the time is now for climate action. As we emerge from the pandemic, it's a critical moment to ensure our future is green, resilient, and inclusive. Making the right investments now can unlock short-term gains, both in terms of jobs and economic growth. They can also deliver long-term benefits, including decarbonizing our economy and making the world more resilient. You, the members of the Carbon Pricing Leadership Coalition, are pioneering a unique public-private initiative that has been critical to raising awareness about a key solution to climate change. You are leading by example in your own policies and operations and encouraging others to join in. Thank you very much for this. The CPLC is now over 5 years old and has helped to crystallize best practices, showcase successful examples, and inspire action. It has also been a member-driven organization. You, the partners, own the ideas and are working collectively to push the work forward. I4C has been pleased to lead the private sector engagements of the CPLC. Coalition has helped galvanize new partnerships with our clients that have advanced our climate business. Importantly, you have adapted the work program to what is happening in the market. Right now, we are seeing a rapid growth of initiatives designed to achieve the same end goal, delivering on the Paris Agreement's promise to keep global warming at or below 2 degrees Celsius. This is where CPLC's task force on net zero and carbon pricing comes in. It helps connect the dots between previous good work on carbon pricing, a key solution to climate change, and those longer-term goals. I strongly believe the results of this task force will help to align public and private sector commitments to reach decarbonization in line with what is needed. Here are some key takeaways from today's interventions. First, we need a common understanding of how to reach net zero. Continued cooperation and sharing of experiences will help us to consolidate the best thinking and get to net zero in an inclusive, fair, and effective way. Second, the private sector is already demonstrating leadership. However, for this leadership to be credible, we need to have more clarity on strategies companies are using and transparency on the results being achieved. Short-term targets that serve as milestones may be useful in this regard. Third, and finally, we need to harness all opportunities to mobilize the needed investment. Carbon pricing policies provide the right signals and incentives for business. Therefore, we should redouble our efforts to help governments to put in place smart carbon pricing policies and to drive decarbonization at scale. In closing, the growing demand for companies and investors to be ready for future climate shocks makes it all the more important for us to get the policies right and get them in place. This includes carbon pricing, and we will need a strong partnership between governments and the private sector to deliver solutions that work. Let me reassure you that I4C and the broader World Bank Group are stepping up on climate. Our new Climate Action Change Plan raises our targets for climate finance, and we are doubling down to help our clients reach goals of the Paris Agreement. I hope the examples and initiatives shown by our speakers today can help us all think about increasing our ambition. I look forward to following the rollout of the Net Zero Task Force report and to working with the CPLC and with all of you to advance carbon pricing as a solution. Thank you. Thank you.
And with that inspiring piece from Stephanie von Friedeberg, we close today's plenary in partnership with the Carbon Pricing Leadership Coalition. Do remember to post any questions you might have on today's subject and tune into the workshops where we get to dive even deeper into these complex issues. I look forward to seeing you again tomorrow for our third and final plenary that will focus on rethinking finance for climate action, with a really great lineup of speakers who are going to share the latest thinking from around the world of finance and how it's tackling climate change. I look forward to seeing you then. Goodbye.